Welcome to EPJ Pathshala. I am Pirzada Rauf. I teach at Jindal Global University, and today we will talk about issues related to energy crisis in geopolitics. The content of this module is understanding the geopolitics of energy, geopolitics of oil and natural gas, and geopolitics of oil and gas pipelines. The learning outcome of this module would be understanding the concept of oil weapon, rather oil as a weapon, understanding the politics of gas pipeline in special perspective, and discussing the major world disputes in energy and in geopolitical perspective. We have some keywords here, and those keywords are oil as a weapon, media cacophony, geopolitical strategy, and oil. Understanding the geopolitics of energy, it includes an understanding of energy which has always had a great importance in the development of any civilization and raising the life standard of society. Deficiency of oil delays economic development, while the increased use of energy leads to increase in energy resources exploitation and also a decrease in non-renewable sources. Considering the non-renewability of fossil energy sources, it is more likely that the spatial distribution of its reserves will become more important. Therefore, we will more often have geopolitical tensions and conflicts over the most profitable remaining deposits. The so-called strategic energy eclipse from Arabian Peninsula to West Siberia is not by chance the hottest geopolitical region in the world right now. Within, there are about 70% of crude oil and gas reserves in the world. Over the last 20 years, the only remaining military superpower or superforce, the United States, has spent thousands of billions of dollars, that's amounts of energy, and lost thousands of human lives in order to retain control of this area. However, on the global geopolitical scene nowadays, we have new economic powers like China, Brazil, India, Turkey, and others which have engaged themselves in the battle over the energy resources. We are witnessing the end of cheap primary energy resources which are considered to exist in unlimited amounts until very recently. Over the last 140 years, thousands of billions of barrels of oil have been spent, and the current growing thirst for energy is almost 1,000 billion barrels of oil per second in the world. A question is raised: will future energy production be able to satisfy the demand, and what are the possible geopolitical consequences of global deficiency of energy? Energy crisis, which means a restriction in the energy source supply on the world market at a certain period. It is often related to the shortage of only one energy resource, which is usually one of the highest importance in the energetics, traffic industry, etc. Modern world, which has been basing its development on cheap energy resource for a long time now, since 1970s of the 20th century. It survived few energy, that is oil related crisis, which affected global economy as well as the economy of most countries. The energy weapon nation states remain the most important actors in the geopolitics of energy, and they retain the power and at home the authority of initiating actions that derive from their self-defined national interests. At the same time, they are enmeshed in the complex energy international system wherein petroleum and natural gas have become increasingly fungible as they move downstream through a number of stages, from lifting or extraction to the scale of consumable products. The ability of the state to use energy as a tool is determined by two components, tangible and intangible. The tangible includes its economic needs and capabilities. The intangible covers a range of considerations from its tactical calculations through broad nations. National interests to domestic political contingencies. There are internal and external aspects to both. Among the internal elements in the policy mix is the revenue needs of an exporting country. Any significant reduction in earnings decreases the funds available to the government. The Saudi leaders, their anxieties as to the last point in the aftermath of Arab Spring have prompted them to raise public spending for social programs and general stimulus at the time of global economy when it is in sluggish. Iran, by contrast, has depleted its revenues. Commerce has been curtailed across the board, and there is a wide gap between living standards and expectations that already has cut tolerance for further stringencies to the bone. The ability of the state to use oil as a weapon of geopolitics depend on market influence of the state. The country with its greatest share of export has the greatest influence over the supply market. That is what which occurred in 1973 when the Arab members of OPEC together cut back on petroleum exports while trying to target specific countries. The country's role as a protector of natural resources have been shifting towards an agent of global power. The resources are no longer just a use value for the countries, but after its exchange, in exchange value, it has jumped into being a global power value. The capitalizing ability of the big power and their abilities to control the global politics through the resource control has turned the resources in a living entity which formulate global power for or against the people. The special analysis becomes quite rampant, for it not only at all the poor at the same level, some of them in imperial states rejoices over the country's use of resources weapon against the weak country which lacks the power. The resource thus also has power to create and destroy unity for the particular class. In this scenario, it is not any wonder that weapon of mass destruction, which has become redundant due to global availability, is to be replaced by energy weapon, for it is the energy that derives the economy. Therefore, its control becomes a major issue to determine the global equation of power. The inexhaustible energy source in the perspective becomes a major tool in determining the power game at global level. Of all the exhaustible resources, oil, due to its rareness and high power generating capacity, has emerged both as a dollar as well as a weapon. We have energy as a geopolitical strategy. The readiness of a given state to use energy, dealings as a tool to advance a strategic agenda, diplomatic or economic, which will be determined by two sets of factors, the tangible and the intangible. The tangible includes its economic needs and capabilities. The intangible covers the national as well as international interest of the state, in which there are internal as well as external dimensions. Among the internal is the ability to create revenue. Any significant reduction in earnings decreases the funds available to government. The factors influencing how silent the impact of the policy making include: it has capital reserves, its degree of economic diversification, its standard of living, and the populace's sensitivity to any manifest or latent danger to its lowering. By this criteria, there is a striking contrast between Saudi Arabia and Iran. For example, the former has enormous reserves, little diversification, a relatively high standard of living as sustained by government programs combined with the population. Also, Saudi leaders, their anxieties as to the last point in the aftermath of Arab Spring have prompted them to raise public spending for social programs and generating a general stimulus at the time when the global economy, which is in a slow motion and is slowly growing. Iran, by the contrast, has depleted its reserves. The commerce has been curtailed across the board, and there is a wide gap between living standards and expectations that already has been cut severely, and the tolerance for further stringencies is very less. In the second part, we will deal with energy as a weapon. The degree of influence which the country exercises in the world market determines its capacity to use oil as a weapon. Among suppliers, the larger a country's share of aggregate exports, the greater its potential to influence. That can be compounded by acting in concert with other exporters. At the present time, the picture is especially complicated by the turbulence in the Middle East that has unsettled regional politics and domestic politics alike. For Saudi Arabia, a more accurate sense of vulnerability on the number of fronts makes the promotion of stability its priority. That pertains certainly to international energy markets. It's stepping forward to raise production as an offset to the loss of boycotted Iranian oil confirms to its thinking about the imperative to ensure market stability. It conforms as well as to its political interest in bringing the Iranian leadership to heel. By so using its surge capacity, Saudi Arabia as also nurtures its image as an international good citizen devoted to global stability and not only to advancing its national interests. All major oil producers in the world are in a position to control the economy of other nations. But one cannot undermine the influence of imperial powers in framing the political economy of such rich nations. Here we have some examples, and it includes Kuwait, other Gulf producers, Iraq, Libya, and beyond the Middle East, energy surplus countries as in the Caspian Basin and Central Asia. The same holds true for Nigeria, Indonesia, Mexico, Venezuela, where the need to generate national income to meet the needs of the poor population are even more exigent. The Central Asian leaders, here's to the centralized power of Soviet-era secular regimes, see fundamentalist Islamic forces as one threat to their rule, hence their acute concern about developments elsewhere. For example, Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, Iraq. In those places, they are partisans of stability and opponents of self-ist movements in all its forms. Now, the geopolitics of oil and natural gas. Oil is pervasive in our daily lives. It powers most modes of transport. It is in the plastics we use, the composites which we build, even the most modern planes. It connects every country on this earth through trade. It is claimed by national governments as multinational corporations as a good resource, a traded good, a tax revenue, and also something of profit. The geopolitics of oil is about the control of the reserves, the refining and the production of chain, pricing, the distribution. Historically, there have been two countervailing forces: the producers, very few oil-rich nations which hold the vast majority of known reserves, and consumers, large developed or developing economies. But now there is a third major force transforming the geopolitics of oil in the world, and it is the force that favors the US technology. Here, the thing which becomes very important is the geographical and the political dimensions of oil. Who holds the oil? Approximately 80% of the world's proven reserves are just in 8 countries, 7 of which are described by the US Energy Information Administration as either failed or high risk or potentially high risk states. Only Canada at 173 billion barrels or 10% of the reserves is neither a failed or nor a high risk or a potentially high risk state. The major oil producing states on this planet, on the other hand, do not represent the same risk profile as the reserve holding states. Russia and Saudi Arabia are virtually tied as the largest producers at about 10 million barrels per day, representing 25% of the world production. The US is also a major producer at 7.5 million barrels per day, that is 9% of the production. A production of oil followed pure economic logic and the largest reserves were preferentially exploited, then production would be centered in the Middle East where costs are estimated lower than $10 US barrel. Production did follow this trend from 1955 to 1975 due to perceived greater regional stability and the introduction of super tankers to ease transport. However, the pattern changed as large resource holding states nationalized production during 60s and 70s. Nationalization along with the big price increases driven by OPEC spurred new field developments in UK, Norway, Alaska, Nigeria, Gulf of Mexico, Angola, Russia, Canada, and geographical diversification of the production away from Middle East. In 2011, the CEO of Saudi Aramco recognized that the more balanced geographical distribution of unconventional was reducing demand for growth in conventional output from the Middle East. In one of the subtopics, we deal with the politics of oil, which is the politics of oil is to struggle to negotiate who gets how much and how is it to be used. Since most oil resources are owned by governments, such political negotiations are typically between the host state and the company that wants those resources. There is always a mutual dependence. For the holder, the value of the resource depends on its being extracted and sold. For the firms without enough of their own resources like the super major international oil companies. The success of this depends on securing access to oil supply owned by the state. The object of the politics of oil therefore is determined and it determines the terms of access and arrangements for sharing revenues. Currently, transnational state-owned national oil companies, that is NOCs, such as PetroChina, Petrobras, are competing with IOCs that produce much of the world oil. However, the IOCs control a relatively small proportion of world's reserves. For IOCs and some NOCs, access to the sovereign resources of another country is imperative, and both types of companies are relying increasingly heavily on their home states for political and diplomatic support in these relationships. The vulnerabilities and opportunities created by the flow of oil and therefore money are at core of international oil geopolitics and heavily influence domestic and foreign policies of both exporting and importing states. The oil rents, defined as the difference between selling price per barrel at the world market and the cost per barrel of production, are particularly very high in the major producing Gulf countries, as well as in the failed and high-risk states posing threats to global security. In 2013, the oil ranks to GDP for high-risk states especially. Oil is a currency of state interests. The range of the government, its take on oil revenue is extremely high. Iran 93 to 96%, Russia 70 to 72%, Libya 73 to 89%, Iraq 90 to 95%. While low oil prices and the case of Iran sanctions weakens the ability of the high risk and the failed states to pose a security threat, they simultaneously weaken the hand of democratic world's vital allies in the Gulf. The majority, 63% of the world's daily oil production is transported by sea to consuming nations, and 70% of that must go through potentially insecure choke points. The Strait of Malacca, the Strait of Bosphorus in Asia, the Bab el-Mandeb and Hormuz of the Middle East. Securing these routes is a crucial national security priority of United States, China and Gulf states, and requires diplomatic collaboration between consuming and producing nations. To get to China and South Asia by sea, oil must pass through one of the most strategically important and contentious bodies of water in the world. The Strait of Malacca. This strait is a 500-mile long narrow passage between Malaysia and Indonesian island of Sumatra, and is also home to many modern pirates. The strait funnels 1/4 of the world's seaborne oil and 2/3 of internationally traded liquefied natural gas. Geopolitically, this body of water is expected to become ever more contentious as tensions between China and Taiwan rise and China claims more of South China Sea as its sovereign water. The US will certainly have a role to play here in guaranteeing security for its allies and to protect its interests. Also strategically important is the Strait of Bosphorus. Istanbul is considered one of the CIA's most critical stations, in part because it is split by Bosphorus, the only way to Mediterranean and to the Western European markets for Russian and Central Asian oil and LNG from Black Sea and Crimea. Turkey, which retains the sovereign right to restrict passage through Bosphorus. One reason this is such a vital CIA station. In the Middle East, the Bab el-Mandeb, straight at bottom of the Red Sea between politically unstable Yemen and Somalia, provides entrance to the Suez Canal and sump pipeline. Each day, 3 million barrels of oil and major LNG shipments pass through this strait for transshipment to supply Western Europe. The other part of this is geopolitics of oil and gas pipelines. The control over the gas line and its transportation is the major discourse in geopolitical power assertion. The method of distributing the resource surplus is a method to control the wealth pot. The inauguration of the Dawlat Abad Sarkhas Khanjiran pipeline in early January of 2013, connecting Iran's northern Caspian region with Turkmenistan's vast gas field, may go unnoticed amid the Western media's cacophony that is apocalypse now for the Islamic regime in Tehran. The event sent strong messages for the regional security. Within the space of 3 weeks, Turkmenistan has committed its entire gas exports to China, Russia and Iran. It has no urgent need of the pipelines that the United States and the European Union have been advancing. Are we hearing the faint notes of a Russia-China-Iran symphony? The 182-kilometer Turkmen-Iranian pipeline starts modestly with the pumping of 8 billion cubic meters of Turkmen gas, but its annual capacity is 20 billion cubic meters. The energy requirement of Iran's Caspian region and enable Iran to free its own gas production in the southern fields for export. The mutual interest is perfect. Ashgabat gets an assured market next door. Northern Iran can consume without fear of winter shortages. Tehran can generate more surplus for exports. Turkmenistan can seek transportation routes to the world market through Iran, and Iran can aspire to take advantage of its excellent geopolitical, geographical location as the hub for the Turkmen exports. While we are witnessing a new pattern of energy cooperation at the regional level and dispenses with big oil, Russia traditionally takes the lead. China and Iran follow the example. Russia, Iran, and Turkmenistan have respectively the world's largest, second largest, and fourth largest gas reserves. And China will be consumer par excellence in this century. The matter of this profound consequence to the US global strategy, it matters most of the Russia is that of dominant role as Europe's #1 energy provider if it is to be eroded. So long as the Central Asian countries have no pressing need for new US-backed Trans-Caspian pipeline, Russia is satisfied. The power game between the world's imperial regimes have diverted the issue of resource distribution to that of exercising geopolitical influence by shifting the perspective to resource hegemony. In this summary, we have deficiency of energy which delays economic development, while the increased use of energy which leads to increase in the economic resources, its exploitation, and decrease in non-renewable resources. Also, we found out that oil, which seems to defy the law of gravity, flowing from the lesser developed states to some of the most developed states. The control, which is over the gas line and the transportation, is one of the major discourses in geopolitical power and its assertion. The method of distributing the resource surplus is a method of control and control of this wealth pot. Thank you very much.